Hey g'day, boys and girls, Sheilas and blokes. My name's Jacob, and today I would like to talk about Monster Hunter map remakes. Primarily those found in Rise Sunbreak, but I'll run for a quick history of past remakes before then. So, map remakes in Monhun, well, they're not particularly new. Rise and Sunbreak's reimagined maps are by far the biggest changes we've ever seen a map go through, because prior to this, most map remakes were relatively small. So starting with, in my opinion, the least interesting stuff first, maps will sometimes see small improvements made to their design based on feedback from the previous games in the generation. For instance, these drop cliffs in Tri's Sandy Plains and the Tundra, these were removed in Portable Third and Free Ultimate in favour of a more accessible movement option between these areas. Removing one-way entrances is a popular change you'll find with updates like these. Now, moving on to some of the more fancier stuff, Generations and its Ultimate release brought back many old popular maps from throughout the series' history, and in doing so they added slight elevation in certain areas to incorporate the 4th generation's more vertical map design focus. However, I don't personally find these updates too special since, sure they help us do ledge attacks now, but putting these beside a map made specifically for the 4th generation, you can see the difference in quality. These old maps are still mostly flat from their prior game design philosophy, whereas 4th generation's maps were designed with verticality in mind from the ground up during development, and because of this, they're just more complex. And I'm not calling these old maps bad or anything like that. No, I seriously appreciate the work Capcom done to bring them into Generations, and they serve the hunts perfectly well as they are. One huge positive here with the 4th gen update is the new movement tech in these games makes traversing these old maps far easier now, and I really like the changes in that sense. Plus, I already loved a lot of these old maps before in the past games they're from, so seeing them back in any game in any form, it just makes me really happy. It hits the nostalgia just fine. I think if given enough development time and resources, then perhaps every one of these maps could compare to Monster Hunter 1's dunes that were completely remade for the Ultimate release of Monster Hunter 4. And this was something I'm actually embarrassed to admit I didn't know until about 2 years ago. I've played a couple thousand hours of Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, but I have never played Monster Hunter 1 until recently. But now that I have, just wow, it's incredible how these old maps went from looking so bare bones, like the piles of all these bones you'd find around the original map, to something of Monster Hunter 4's quality level. As you can see here, the base camp already has a huge glow up in Monster Hunter 4, and continuing on outside here, the area is now extremely open, elevated higher up, giving a gorgeous view of the surrounding hunting ground. And while the front areas were completely redesigned for 4 Ultimate's new mechanics, the back exit from camp enters into largely the same design as Monster Hunter 1, albeit with the interior of these areas completely remade for verticality, even above that of Gen's map redesigns. This dude's remake is really damn good, happily sitting beside 4 Ultimate's other maps like the Ancestral Steppe, the Sunken Hollow, and all the others too in quality, while at the same time keeping the feel of Monster Hunter 1's map layout very close. I'll admit this is most likely because it keeps the loading screens, and I'll talk more about those in a minute as I move into Rise Sunbreak. So as we all know, Rise did something incredible by remaking a few maps from the old school games, but in the New World style of it being one seamless area and not a series of loading screens. And personally, I think it achieved that, it's pretty well done. I don't want to call them terrible because these are really good maps. All the maps in Monster Hunter Rise are incredible, but when I sit there and compare them to the originals, my nostalgia blind view of them doesn't think Rise's versions hold up as well. Look, I'll say this right now, as people are likely to bring this up in the comments before finishing the video if I was to leave this for later. I am very well aware most of my complaints are a combination of Switch hardware limitations, or necessary changes that needed to be done when adapting these maps to the newer style. But just because there's an extremely good reason for something being how it is, that doesn't mean I have to like it. So I'll clarify most of what I say from this point on is my extremely strong opinion, and I myself know exactly how silly some of these are to complain about, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I'll start with Rise's base maps first, being the Sandy Plains and the Flooded Forest, which were both originally from Monster Hunter Tri. But I think it's better to compare them to the versions from Portable Third, since this portable entry to the 3rd generation didn't have underwater gameplay, and thus the Flooded Forest in Portable Third wasn't as flooded as Tri's. It's actually this version that was used as the base for Rise's Flooded Forest, which you can mainly tell from the entrance to the cave in the middle area, which is absent in both Tri and 3 Ultimate, since in those games that area was submersible and the entrance to that cave seemingly gets blocked in that zone when flooded like this. I should also point out that the deserted island in Portable Third got a similar revamp, removing the underwater areas, and this version is also the one we saw get revamped again in Monster Hunter Generations. But anyway, since I'm already talking about the Flooded Forest, I'll finish it first before I start on the plains. So the Flooded Forest is both my least favourite map in Rise, but my favourite reimagined map at the same time. I imagine that's confusing, so to answer the first part as to why I dislike the map, well, it's just plain ugly, I have to be honest. It's so brown and browny green, it's horrendously ugly, it looks like it. I just hate it. This is the polar opposite to what the Flooded Forest looked like in the original games. The original map still had brown, but besides that being the only colour on it, there was much more vibrant greens and blues and purples, and in some cases even a lovely orange. It just looked a lot better. Or at least I think it did. Look, I'm colourblind, okay, and I don't see colours the same way as everyone else does, but I can see a blood enough to know that Rise's colour palette just ain't it. Almost every map in Rise looks so washed out of colour, it blends the environments together, making a lot of them look extremely ugly, with the biggest case being the Flooded Forest. The old games had higher saturation that made colours pop out, it was all so gorgeous. I don't understand why this couldn't have been the default in Rise at all. Thankfully, if you're playing on a system other than the Switch, which unfortunate for me is where I actually spent most of my time playing Rise, then you can play around with the graphic filters and the HDR settings, so when I replayed Rise on the PS5 I had a far better time. But unfortunately I cannot show you any of that since my gameplay doesn't properly record my TV's HDR settings, nor can I make a video in 4K yet, so I apologise to you Monster Hunter Rise, I'm letting you down here, but in all fairness, you let us down first. I have detoured away from the Flooded Forest for a bit there, but it was important to do this since the muted colour palette is something that affects Rise's maps, and the next two I'll be talking about shortly. And yeah, that all said and done, it's really just the colours as to why this map's my least favourite in Rise. Visually it's just ugly and bland, and it's not something I like running around and walking in and really just fighting monsters, it's not nice. So onto why it's my favourite reimagined map, well, I think it's translated very well from the old world to the new. Every area feels like it is where they would be and should be when looking at the old areas next to the newer ones. It even kept the hidden exit out of the base camp that was in Monster Hunter Tri and 3 Ultimate. Although it doesn't lead to the waterfall area anymore, it still leads somewhere when it didn't in P3rd. Another really cool feature I like to look at is in the cave, that giant hole you can run and jump into or climb out of with the wire bugs. That used to just be a light to show you where you'd climb up with the vines in the original game, but them just taking small details like that and incorporating them into the map, it's just something really cool that I love. And also being able to climb the big pyramid too, that's bloody awesome. Even if you don't fight anything up there and you only go there out of curiosity, it's really cool you can climb up that thing now. So yeah, just ugly looking colours I guess. It's my only real issue with the Flooded Forest. If only they would have added more colour and made this map pop, then I'd love it. Like, this is such a damn good map redesign, it's nearly perfect. Now, next is the Sandy Plains, and I feel like this one lost a lot of what I loved about the original Sandy Plains. Before I even get into the map design itself, the original music here was tossed aside and replaced with something far less interesting in my opinion. Which is honestly just strange, because the Flooded Forest and the Jungle, they both got new arrangements, but this thing just got a completely different piece of music. The Sandy Plains original battle track is my favourite area battle theme in the entire series, which is what makes this new theme stink more. It's a bizarre change, I don't understand why it needed to happen, but it did, and yeah, so onto the map. So, Rise's Sandy Plains feels kind of barren and dead, which you'd think be fitting for a desert, but the original Sandy Plains was more of a savanna rather than just a straight desert. The old plains had far more greenery around the first half of its map, both inside and especially outside the area. Then when you move towards the back half of the map where the sandy plains gets the sandy part, it's mostly dry and, well, sandy, but you can still see trees in the distance that's just absent in Rise's version. This is what I'll admit again was one of those necessary changes when adapting the map, since in a smaller connected area, you cannot have large fiestas showing the biome in full like before, and it's just a shame we've lost it. Also in Rise, we lost some cool spectacles like the Aptonoth and Renopolis herds moving across the savannah in the distance, as well as when running around at night, we no longer see that beautiful star meteor shower thing. Something I bring up a lot when talking about the older games is I loved the outside scenery in older maps. As a little kid, I loved standing there and imagining what it'd be like to one day explore these far off fiestas. That imagination is what I would have liked to have seen here with a full-blown reimagining like this. I know this is all pretty irrelevant to gameplay, but it was small details like these that made the world of Monster Hunter feel alive. Like seeing the map in full, just walking across it and feeling like you're traversing a massive landscape, seeing all the animals in the distance running around. And if I'm being honest, I'm sad we still haven't got to explore what's out there and see the world like how it was shown back in those games. Like, imagine if these remade maps weren't really exploring all of the same areas before, or we went to exploring another section of the hunting ground entirely. Like, imagine if in Rise's map, instead of heading across the savannah into the desert, what if it was just the savannah or the desert and they showed that half of the map in higher detail? Or what if we got to traverse down the canyon towards the watering hole we see from base camp? That area down there could have been the sandy plains in Rise if Capcom were to have reimagined it that way, and I think that would have been much cooler personally. I say all this because the sandy plains in Rise, it feels more dead than before, the colours are muted and the old areas don't quite line up as well when brought into that seamless environment. But one thing I have to give Capcom tremendous props for doing is somehow keeping the exit through the cave from base camp you used to jump down into. The conjoining area in Rise's redesign is now on the other side of the map entirely, so they placed great wire bugs from that spot to fling you into that zone you used to fall into. I love that they've kept that, it's cool. Stuff like that makes the areas feel a bit like how they were before, even if they aren't quite the same now. So this section on the plains I feel was a mess compared to the rest of the video. I've tried to clean up my thoughts here better than my initial take, I hope that was understandable. TLDR, the new version loses its Sylvana feel that I loved in Gen 3, which is a damn shame. I actually have a headcanon excuse I use for these maps, which is Rise's story takes place in a more drier season of Monster Hunter's world, which is why the flooded forest isn't flooded and the plains aren't as green with abundance of wildlife. You can poke holes in that theory like, why isn't the plains the same in P3rd? Well, I don't know, like, the passage of time? Enough of that now since I'm not the game theorist, because I'm finally at the part I can talk about the jungle. And I have a lot to say about the jungle, because this is my favourite map in the entire Monster Hunter series. Jungle's a second generation map, first in Monster Hunter 2, and it was also in Freedom Unite, which was my first Monster Hunter game. And this isn't to be confused with the jungle from Monster Hunter 1, which was later rebranded to the old jungle. One of the main reasons I love the jungle in Monster Hunter so much is I just love the tropical rainforest biome in general. I actually grew up on the edge of one of these myself, so there's a fun little fact about me. Tropical rainforests are bloody gorgeous, I've just got a soft spot for them. They're so colourful, which is something I noticed very quickly isn't the case in Sunbreak, so yes, one final time, Rise's stale colour palette strikes again. Immediately the loss of these bright colours makes the jungle look less pretty than it did before. Also, the jungle now just feels small as all hell. Like, this is the smallest map in Monster Hunter Rise, outside the arena areas like the Arena or the Rampage or Infernal Springs. Rise's jungle is a tiny ass island, it's very disappointing to me. On the positive side, the areas here are almost perfectly translated from old to new. Like, you could stick this version of the map on top of the old one and all the areas will be at basically the exact same spot. It's not perfect, like the middle cave area is off scale, I mean the whole map is off scale, but like the nest area is so bloody small compared to the massive cave zone it used to be. The worst case of losing the massive sense of scale the original one had is that little isle out at sea you used to cross on a sandbar to get to at low tides. It's now brought straight in, and it looks terrible in my opinion. Unlike the sandy plains and the flooded forest where I could blame the passage of time with my headcanon excuse for looking the way it does, there's no way I can explain this. It's purely hardware and redesign limitations at work here. It's a shame. I feel like the map didn't need to be this way. Like, the original jungle was a massive chunk of land you explored. It was really cool to just walk through the zones. The loading screens added so much immersion to the old maps by giving you this massive sense of scale of walking miles between areas. In the jungle, you could see in the distance at Area 2 the shoreline of Area 3, and you could feel the sense of scale this map has by passing through the load screen and looking back up at where you came from. And I know not everyone likes loading screens. Personally, I don't mind if they're in the game or not, and if you're someone who thinks loading screens are stupid, well, I just like to point out to those people that when you really think about it, the long-ass hallways in Monster Hunter World you'd run through between areas, they aren't any different in function. In fact, passing through many of these corridors in World was actually far longer than a 1 to 2 second loading screen, and in some places it's far more tedious. And yes, if you didn't know, the loads were 2 seconds at worst depending on the hardware you're playing on. Okay, this wasn't Skyrim with massive 3-minute loading times. And I'm not calling your opinion wrong if you don't like loading screens by saying this. I'm just pointing out something that has the same function, but in my opinion it's worse. I know walking another 8 seconds for a seamless map rather than a loading screen doesn't break the immersion for many people, and again, I'm not calling that wrong. For myself, I don't mind either of these. If there's loading screens or no loading screens, I'm happy. It doesn't bother me. It's fine. But what does bother me is the jungle feels small as fuck now, whereas it didn't before. Getting back on track now, another reason the jungle doesn't give off the same vibe to me is those outside area Viestas. The outside zone in the original jungle, it looked stunning, by PS2 standards that is anyways. And I'm not someone who cares much about graphics, okay? To me, the jungle in Sunbreak looks just as good as it did back on the PS2. Only Sunbreak lacks many of the details they have here. Back on the original version of the map, you could see more jungle, you could see more ruins, you could see gorgeous shorelines out along the coastline. All the greenery, the whites and the blues, like, it was so bloody beautiful, you know. And just looking at this in Rise, like, fucking hell it's ugly. Like, for starters, the shitty low poly backdrops they used on the PS2 and the PSP, the PC, I mean even the bloody Switch which Rise was designed to run on. It's just gone, and now replaced with a worse one than they used back in 2006. I know this is a limitation of the Switch, and it's what they had to do for the game to run on such a weak piece of hardware. But the Switch is stronger than a PSP, right? Why couldn't you have done a bit better with the backdrop texture, like you did even in the Flooded Forest? The Flooded Forest backdrop is amazing, and I love it. Like, if I would have had this level of quality here in the jungle, I wouldn't care as much. It's even worse when you look out at the shoreline. All that gorgeous, colourful inland sea area, it's just gone. It's replaced with an ugly blur. It's just, bloody hell. I know this isn't something many people will pay attention to hunting monsters, especially in Rise where the game is streamlined down to mainly just fighting monsters. You don't really have to pay attention to these things, but for me, and I imagine there's other players who spent time on the old jungle gathering, running around and just doing stuff, you probably feel the disappointment. Perhaps they could have done the old jungle from Monster Hunter 1 instead. It's not as iconic, but it feels much smaller in scale back then. While keeping the same biome, it even has the caves, so yeah. So I think I've rambled on enough at this point. This is going to be one of those old man yells at cloud moments for me, definitely. And like I said back at the start of Rise's segment, this is an extremely nostalgia-blinded view of these maps, and I really shouldn't be so fussy. And in case I've given anyone the wrong idea about Monster Hunter Rise, I fucking love this game. It's incredibly fun, and even if these maps aren't perfect in my eyes, I'm happy that they're here and they got any makeover at all. And I guess I should point out the Fallen Arena before I send off. This was also an old map from Monster Hunter 2. It's actually a part of the much larger tower map, and the base camp in Rise isn't even the original base camp, but rather it's an area you used to be able to fight in. G'day, this is Jacob here from a week later, realizing now during editing I probably should have expanded upon the Fallen Arena a bit more instead of just leaving it as a couple of sentences. So, as I had just mentioned, the Fallen Arena is a small section of the map from Monster Hunter 2, and this section of the map was actually first introduced in the third generation of Monster Hunter, being one of the special arenas you fight select monsters in, like the Lucid Nagakuga, which was the monster that got added alongside the Fallen Arena in Sunbreak's title update 1. Another section of the map being the tower top was also featured in the 4th generation of Monster Hunter, being another arena map. And outside these two small arenas, the tower has never returned in a Monster Hunter game, not in full anyways, and I think that's a damn shame because the tower is a really interesting map to look at. Like, if you just look at the lore implications of the tower, it being related to the ancient civilization, there's so much they could explore there if they wanted to expand the old story of the Monster Hunter world in another more story-focused Monster Hunter game like what they did in Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. That'd be an interesting angle to approach. And also the tower map itself is just visually really interesting. There's not a whole lot in the Monster Hunter universe kind of like it, in a way, and the areas itself are just really unique. Like, there is several variants of the tower in Monster Hunter Frontier, for example, which I'm showing the footage for right now, that have different areas that connect between them, sort of like when you load in, you go to different subsections. And there's parts of the map that are so big, when you move past a loading screen between areas, it completely changes the map-like display that you're on with all the areas being shown. There's no other map in the Monster Hunter series that has this kind of... Actually, no, saying that, the Everwoods from Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, but you get the idea. Like, the tower's a really interesting map, and I want to see it return in a future game. Okay, so to bring this back into the original video, the Fallen Arena in Sunbreak is perfect. It's the best reimagined map in the game. Like, this looks exactly like how it did in the old games, just because it only uses the two areas, but visually it keeps the outsides perfectly looking exactly how they are, being brought up in Rise's more 5th generation level of detail, like the graphics, like adding more little textures and stuff. It looks amazing. This is how I wanted the older maps to look like. And I don't mean like have it be zone based, but keep the details that were outside the map in the older games, but bring those into the map where you can just roam around them like how they were. So imagine if the Fallen Arena, like going back to what I said kind of with the Sandy Plains, what if the Fallen Arena, the area between the tower and the little area you jump down to, what if all of that in between there was explorable, like how it looks there, and you just run around in the little areas as sort of more little arenas? Like, that's the kind of thing they could do by making these massive maps feel smaller but still big at the same time, keeping the original feel of the old maps in scale, but making them feel interconnected without zone loading screens like in the newer games. That's just an approach I'd like to see done if they don't go and make a whole open world Monster Hunter game with a map, which I'm kind of thinking about making a video on, talking about these kind of map stuff, about theorizing what they could do for that. Anyways, back to the original pre-recorded segment. I'm rambled on long enough. Monster Hunter Wilds looks like it's going to have some crazy large maps, if not outright an open world game, and I'm excited to see how those unfold. I actually really like Monster Hunter Rise's maps, how they're also big and seamless, even more so than Monster Hunter World because there's no more invisible walls, or there's not as many when crossing between the middle of the map. Being able to wire bug across the entire zone is just really cool, it's just fun, and a map of a much larger scale on a better system than the Switch could 100% pull off the old world maps the way I envisioned it when I was 12. And my god, at this point the script is a mess. I don't even think people are going to like it, I'm just ranting over nonsense that doesn't really matter. If I hadn't already said twice now in my past videos that I was going to make a video out of this, I wouldn't even bloody bother putting this out, I'm sorry. Well, with that all finally out of my system, please like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't. I'm open to dialogue in the comments, so please share your thoughts on the redesigned maps, or critique my insane rant below, and subscribe for more less ranty content in the future. Alright, that's all. Have a good one, people. Cheers.